Now we're going to go down to anachronistic mountain strata that we can observe around the planet and see, well, what contributed toward that? Worldwide flood? Creationism? Or is it explicable better with evolution? The issue is both are not provable point for point for point because we can't reproduce and falsify or observe what happens. But we can look at evidences that best support one side or the other. The overwhelming evidence seems to support better a recent creation, one that was created by an intelligent designer, because of the irreducible complexity of life forms all around the planet that take too much time to evolve, greater than the estimate of age of the universe. And it would be much better to believe in an intelligent designer because there's evidence that there very well, most plausibly, is one. It's a belief system, and if it's corroborated by the preponderance of evidence, I'll go with that until something better comes along. So here we are, BibleStudyManuals.net. We're looking in K31. And we're looking for the word anachronistic, anachronistic mountain strata. Anachronistic, it's not corroborating the time that it appears to have been, or that we estimate the time of those mountain strata to have been observable, be around, be existent. And in every mountainous region, on every continent, not just a little area here or there seems to be numerous examples of supposedly old rock strata superimposed on top of young strata. In the wrong place. In the absence of definite structural evidence to the contrary, one would naturally suppose that the lowermost strata must necessarily have been first deposited and therefore be older. But the fossils often seem to belie this assumption, and it is the fossils which govern the assigned formation age according to evolutionists. As noted previously, the official explanation of this sort of anachronism is in terms of what is variously called an overthrust, thrust fault, low-angle fault, nepe, detachment thrust, or similar term. It's kind of imagined by geologists in order to explain what could have happened. Usually the explanation lacks a lot of corroborative details, so it's more of a fantasy than an educated guess. The concept is of a large section of stratified rock being elevated and slid over on top of the adjacent rocks, so that the older rocks on the bottom of the moving mass will then be on top of the younger rocks on the top of the stationary rocks. Subsequent erosion then is usually assumed to have worn off the younger rocks on top of the displaced topography. Too often this happens, and too often that's this is an oddball thing. No, it happens all the time, innumerable times in every mountain range. It is recognized that phenomena of this sort have taken place on a small scale in certain localities where there is ample evidence of intense past faulting and folding. However, these visible confirmations of the concept are definitely on a small scale, usually in terms of a few hundreds of feet, whereas many of the so-called great overthrust areas occupy hundreds or even thousands of square miles. We're stretching it. It seems almost fantastic to conceive of such a huge area and masses of rocks really behaving in such a fashion unless we are ready to accept catastrophism of an intensity that makes the Noah deluge seem quiescent by comparison. Certainly the principle of uniformity is inadequate to account for them. Nothing we know of present Earth movements, of rock compressive and shearing strengths, of the plastic flow of rock materials, or of other modern physical processes gives any observational basis, no corroboration for believing that such things are happening now or even could have happened, except under extremely unusual conditions. Worldwide flood. Hubert and Ruby admit, since their earliest recognition, the existence of large overthrusts have presented a mechanical paradox that has never been satisfactorily resolved. Fix my mouse here. There we go. They also say, to illustrate the character of these important areas, we might consider the well-known Hart Mountain thrust of Wyoming. This supposed thrust occupies roughly a triangular area, 30 miles wide by 60 miles long. Get the large area, with its apex at the northwest east corner of the Yellowstone Park. It consists of about 50 separate blocks of Paleozoic strata. We have Ordovician, Devonian, and Mississippian blocks, resting essentially horizontally and conformable on Eocene beds, some so-called 250 million years younger. Wow. Pierce shows many pictures of the fault line, all of them looking for all the world like any other normal contact between chronological deposited strata. And even more mysterious factor is that there appear to be no source beds from which the thrust blocks could have broken off. So the Hart Mountain thrust, they said, has long been structurally perplexing because there are no known structural roots or source from which it could have been derived. So you make up a fantasy and you have no supportive evidence where you look around for it. Furthermore, there is no known surface fault or fault zone within or adjoining the region from which the thrust sheet could have been derived. Maybe think something else. How about a worldwide flood? Not only is there no indication of where the superposed rocks could have come from, unless, of course, they were normally deposited on top of the underlying Eocene strata, as all appearance indicates, a worldwide flood, but there is no physical or mechanical explanation of how 50-odd blocks could all have individually slid into place, huge ones. Pierce's best guess is simply gravity, but he acknowledges this explanation to be essentially inadequate. I wonder if he spoke that out too loud. A close-up of the Hart Mountain thrust plain plainly reveals the lack of any real evidence of thrusting. The real pertinent question is, why is not the entire fault plane heavily brecciated or distorted? If all this happens, you're going to have a lot of damage because it's violent and it's comfortable. No brecciation or distortion. The fact that there are many places where the contact line is clean cut and sharp, like somebody just went ahead and used a razor blade and said, okay, we'll just cut this sharp. Looking very like a normal bedding plane, as it certainly appears to be, that means that, at least at this locality, the Eocene series was laid down before the strata of the other three blocks, the Ordovician, Devonian, and Mississippian. Uniformitarians and evolutionists, of course, absolutely refuse even to consider such a possibility, and so will continue to call the Hart Mountain thrust all physical evidence to contrary of notwithstanding what they can observe. How about a worldwide flood? Oh, no. The Lewis overthrust of Montana is one of the most famous and unbelievable of the supposed overthrust regions, being, according to recent estimates, some 350 miles wide, 6 miles thick, with an inferred horizontal displacement of at least 35 to 40 miles. What kind of force did that? Well, the black rocks on the upper half of the mountain are Precambrian. They should be at the bottom, but they're at the top, upper half. The lighter colored rocks below Cretaceous, about 500 million years old, so-called, years younger. Although there are slight indications of folding both above and below the contact line, these are certainly no greater than at any normal unconformity. Unconformity means it doesn't agree with the worldwide flood, with the evolutionists, but it seems to imply that a worldwide flood came in there. I don't know any other cause. It is clearly only uniformist assumption that says the 350 mile by 40 mile of upper beds were deposited before the lower beds were laid down, and then 350 miles of 40 mile lower beds were thrust under them later by a force so large that it is not even feasible. There's nothing even the worldwide flood dwarfs it, and then leaving no evidence of such a catastrophic event. We're back to Disney cartoons here. It requires a tremendous and entirely unwarranted extrapolation to infer from small-scale folds and thrusts that overthrusting can occur on the infinitely greater scale required to account for Lewis's overthrust and others like it. 350 miles by 40 miles. Oh yeah, just something came in there and just kind of lifted up. Maybe God did it. Oh, we can't believe in God. Okay. if it would be intensely deformed, and that the plane especially would everywhere be brecciated, rock formations consisting of broken up sharp rock fragments and fine-grained sand or clay embedded in the other rocks, evidencing some violent activity, usually as a result of some great forces imposed upon them, deformed and perhaps metamorphosized. Another difficulty with the concept of the Lewis overthrust, as the evolutionists put it, is that it should have produced a large mass of broken rock in front of it and along the sides, but this has not been found. It's clean. But a gigantic 350-mile slab moving over ground, as it is now believed to have existed, should have scarred and broken the hills and have itself been broken to a greater or less extent depending on local conditions. A 350-mile rock slab with no evidence of any violent activity. Really? Are you kidding me? No evidence of either of these things have been found. So we look at this, the almost perfectly horizontal nature of the Lewis overthrust contact line. Horizontal, not broken up, as revealed in the photograph that they supply in this book. There is certainly no apparent indication of any substantial movement or amount of shearing distortion along the surface. Slight differential movements on the two sides of the bedding plane due to differences in structural characteristics of shale and limestone have caused some slight distortion, particularly opening up a clear-cut split along the contact. All along this contact, though, for at least a mile, a very thin 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch layer of shale-like material made of fine clay particles is found. That's all you find, the damage, adhering in some places to the upper Algonquin limestone and some to the underlying Cretaceous shales, which are lithologically quite distinctive from the layer itself. It seems inconceivable that this very fine layer would have been left so intact if the limestone had actually been thrust over the shale as the 350-mile slab was thrust one under the other, as the Lewis overthrust interpretation demands. Careful study of the various locations of the Lewis overthrust showed no evidence of any grinding or sliding action or slickened sides, such as one would expect to find on the hypotheses of a vast overthrust. 350-mile rock slab and no noticeable damage, except a little dust, 1/16 to an 1/8 inch layer. Wow. Another amazing fact was the occurrence of 2/4 inch layers of Alton limestone inserted in layers with Cretaceous shale. These always occurred below the general contact line of Alton limestone and shale. Likewise, careful study of these intercalations showed not the slightest evidence of abrasive action such as one would expect to find if a 350-mile rock slab was slid underneath another one, to find it if these were shoved forward in between layers of shale as the overthrust theory demands. What a theory. Decades of no proof. And you haven't suggested an alternative. In light of such physical evidence as cited, how is it possible to defend any longer the grand fiction of the Lewis overthrust? There ought to be no reasonable doubt that the limestones were actually deposited after the shales on which they lie, and with a whole bunch of water of the worldwide flood. Therefore, they are younger in geologic age. Well, just because the fossils are there, they're supposed to be older? Maybe they're all the same age, and the age thing is all messed up. How old are the fossils? As old as the rock. How old is the rock? As old as the fossils. Another fiction. The problem of overthrusting becomes still more difficult when an attempt is made to understand it from the viewpoint of engineering mechanics. The mass of rock in the Lewis overthrust slab, for example, must have weighed approximately 800,000 billion tons. Assuming for the sake of argument that sufficient force could somehow be generated in the Earth's crust, which, by the way, would not be a normative uniformitarian event by any stretch of the imagination, to start such a mass would not be a normative uniformitarian stretch. To start such a mass moving with both a vertical and lateral component, moving vertically against the force of gravity and laterally against the frictional force along the sliding plane, it still does not allow that really large blocks could be moved in this manner. It can be calculated on the basis of known friction coefficients for sliding blocks so that much shearing stress would be developed on a large block that the material itself would fail in shear or compression and therefore could not be transported as a coherent block at all. It would be rubble. More on this next time.